Sweet. So we've got an agenda here, so we're kind of going to go over Dispute Games 101. What are they? Why are they important to us? Then we're going to lay out the generic dispute game design. So this is kind of like an outline for our generic dispute game contracts. And then we're going to kind of build up on some pretty simple concepts, which is incentive compatibility, which is bonding, the chess clock, which allows us to have this time-boxed game, and then also the on-chain source of truth, and introducing more actors. Going forward, we're basically going to cover Canon's dispute games, so how this generic design can actually be implemented to be used with Canon, and that will cover the block hash bisection game as well as the execution trace bisection game. And so in advance, this is kind of an information-dense PowerPoint, so if you guys have any questions, feel free to raise your hands kind of midway through. So, Dispute Games 101. So, kind of a 30,000-foot view of dispute games is that they're a mechanism for finding the correct truth among many conflicting claims. So we had Mark kind of go through what claims are and why they're important, and then players of the game can make claims about their relative views of the truth, and the game's goal is to identify correct truth among this set of claims. And we actually didn't invent dispute games. They've been studied by game theorists for a long time for things like information sharing networks, legal disputes, and contract negotiations. And so why are they useful to us? Well, too long didn't read, protecting optimism against considering malicious chain histories as canonical post-decentralization, and bringing the upgrade keys closer to Mordor. In our case, more specifically, the dispute game is necessary. We find ourselves in a situation where the untrusted party disagrees with the claim that was made by another untrusted party. Because this claim can be a lot of things. It can be that withdrawal message, it can be a block hash, it can be pretty much anything that we want to plug in here. That's kind of the whole point of making it generic. And so we have no concept of the correctness of these participants' claims, only that they do disagree with one another. And so because of that, we need this dispute game in order to determine the truthy claim. So kind of lead into the generic dispute game design that we've laid out. And so to start off, we had some goals whenever we started this design process. So first of all, we wanted to create that outline for a set of generic dispute game contracts that is agnostic to security models. So it has to have the capacity to support both fault and validity proofs. At the beginning in Canon, we're pretty much only going to be using fault proofs, but it should have the capacity for us to, if we ever want to, just drop in a validity proof to skip the dispute game entirely, or to basically reduce computation in certain sections of the game. And it should also support multiple fault-proof VMs and validity-proof models. So Mark kind of touched on this a little bit at first. It's really, really important that we don't just rely on a single fault-proof VM or a single validity-proof model, so that if there's any bug in any of those implementations, that's not just considered the canonical truth. And so candidates for fault-proof VMs right now are MIPS, which is currently in Canon, and then also RISC-V, which is asterisk. Proto is working on this. Odds are we're going to go with MIPS first. And it also needs to be simple enough to formally verify with relative ease. It's really, really important that this is correct and actually works, because this is supposed to be securing the network in terms of like the output submissions, also withdrawals, et cetera, et cetera. And so today we'll be primarily covering that fault-proof variant of the generic game that will be utilized in Canon. But in the future, we can actually plug in a ZK proof, like we said, to skip the dispute game entirely, or move pieces of the trusted computation off-chain. So we'll get into like the resolution process as well as creating the claims going down the tree, but some of those things we can actually skip by creating a validity proof for. At first, we probably won't. So we start off with like this really simple concept of a nested dispute game. So we have these three simple ideas that we need. So first of all, it has to be incentive compatible. And incentive compatibility in this game establishes that the participants are rewarded for telling the truth and penalized for lying. And that reward comes in financial terms, same with the penalty. And it also always has to resolve within a maximum time limit. So we have this fault-proof window whenever somebody proposes an output or creates a withdrawal claim, that we have to have an answer as to whether their claim is correct or invalid before that fault-proof window actually finishes, so that if it is invalid, we can make the proper corrections. And it also has to have a source of objective truth to resolve the claims at the bottom level of the tree. So to start off, what does nested mean? We have this simple data structure that's called a claim. So you can kind of see this root claim here, and it has a counterclaim nested under it, and then there's these two counterclaims nested under that counterclaim. And you kind of just keep stacking these down. And so claims are effectively commitments to a state. They'll resolve to true or false, but at the time of creation, the value that they resolve to is unknown. The root claim is the initial claim of the game. It may be a withdrawal message, a block hash, a Merkle's fault-proof VM state, etc. We can kind of plug pretty much anything in here. And then the counterclaims have this property that they nest below another claim, but they also always disagree with their parent. Like if you agreed with the root claim, you wouldn't want to counter it because you agree with it and it's the claim that you would have made if that claim didn't already exist. So we start off with bonding, right? So in order for honest actors to create counterclaims against dishonest actors' claims on chain, there must be an incentive for them to do so. They have to pay gas in order to create these claims, etc. You have to incentivize them to do it. And vice versa, there must be a disincentive for actors to create dishonest claims in the first place. So in comes bonds. For every claim that gets created, a bond must be attached to it that can cover the cost of creating a possible counterclaim. And so possible is a really important keyword here, is that those claims don't have to be countered. Like you can basically create a claim, people can just agree with it, and because you have this property that there should be a disincentive for actors to create dishonest claims in the first place, like people shouldn't actually want to counter a truthy claim. But if they do, there has to be a bond attached to the claim that can cover the costs of countering it. And so if the claim resolves to false, the bond will be paid out to the party who is able to actually disprove that claim. And this brings us to our next critical point, which is that there always must be a single correct response to any given claim in the game. We're about to look at why. So we've kind of changed our diagram here to color the nodes for their truthiness. And we also kind of visualize the bonds attached to them by just showing some ETH next to each of the claims. And so there's a really big problem here, which is that if we allow for multiple correct responses to a claim, the bond supplied must be split up among the parties who disprove the claim, which increases the size of the bond. So if you think about it, this counterclaim was supplied before either of these two existed, and this bond was also supplied when this counterclaim was created. So this bond was created in mind with, they had no idea how many counterclaims could be in there. So if we allow multiple successful counterclaims, this bond would have to be able to cover many claims, which means we'd have to add this crazy upper bound. It would become really expensive to actually do that. So, yeah, remember the bond must cover the cost of a possible counterclaim. So because of this, there's this property that we can only have a single correct response for any given claim here. So we've corrected the diagram to show this, to basically this bond is going to cover this one because it was able to disprove the invalid claim above it. And so calculating the bond. So we kind of touched on this whenever Mark made his presentation, but this is just a more in-depth version of how we currently have the bond calculation set out. So first of all, you have the challenge gas cost. This is the amount of gas that it's going to actually cost to create your counterclaim in the dispute game contracts, multiplied by the base fee, which is the current L1 base fee at the time of the creation of the counterclaim, times this thing called a safety factor, and then plus the off-chain proof generation cost. So we kind of dive into deeper into what each of these are. The first two are pretty easy to understand, which is the gas to call the contract, the current L1 base fee, and then the safety factor. So this is something that we're really going to need to hammer out and figure out how what's the most optimal way to set it. But the safety factor can be defined in multiple ways. The whole idea behind it is that we need a value that can ensure that the cost of the next step of counterclaiming is going to basically cover, the bond is going to cover that next possible counterclaim. And Kelvin and I had a long conversation about this last night. This is actually pretty hard to do. At the moment, the leading idea here is to derive this value from a time-weighted average price oracle that will be able to track the fluctuation in the base fee on L1 over a given period of time. And there are a lot of other ways that we can do this, so if any of you guys have ideas, I would love to hear them. And then off-chain proof generation cost. This is kind of the roughest one of all, which is that it's like a rough value to cover the cost in electricity, hardware, etc. required to challenge that claim. And so it'll be impossible to actually accurately account for this. So we're going to probably need to initially estimate it, and then it'll kind of be adjusted via trial and error The whole point is that this bond should always, under every single circumstance, be able to cover the cost of the next possible counterclaim. And so, an aside, and I kind of talked about this whenever in Mark's presentation, but we have this thing that we've been floating around but isn't kind of part of the current spec called the escalation game. And so we can introduce this thing that can reduce the bond requirement of the initial claim called an escalation game. It enables cheaper withdrawals because the initial claim's bond may be smaller, and it also can be used to increase the cost of attack by increasing the stakes of each incorrect claim. So the escalation game functions as follows. There's also another version of it that's not on the slide, but we'll talk about that in a second. So as you step down this tree, what we can do is we can double the bond at each level of the dispute game up to a max, right? And you don't want to allow that bond to just grow infinitely because you can get to a point where somebody puts money down and it just can't be covered anymore. So in order to reduce proof generation costs, we can also introduce levels of the dispute that do not commit to new information. And so this is one of Carl's ideas where basically you have like the two parties before the game even starts disagreeing with each other like toddlers and saying, no, it's not, yes, it is, no, it's not. And each one of those back and forths would actually raise the cost of the initial counterclaim of the game. So once again, this is not actually specified in the current dispute resolution protocol, but it is a simple feature which can be added if we need to reduce the initial bond size and add some extra assurance that these bonds will always be able to cover the cost of a possible counterclaim. So chess clocks. Remember that property about the game being, so basically the game needs to be incentive compatible, but it also must always resolve within that maximum time limit. So that ensures several things. A player cannot deadlock the game by going offline. So this is really, really important. If we don't time box the game, what somebody can do is they can join the game and basically say, okay, I'm going to create a pivot and then somebody can counter me, but I'm just never going to respond, right? And because of that, you enter a situation in where like that game can just deadlock forever and never resolve. And also, we need to make sure that the result of the game is correctly decided before the end of a fault-proof window. This is super important so that basically if somebody creates an invalid claim, an invalid root claim on something, we can take action before that fault-proof window actually passes. So we introduce a chess clock, which basically it's exactly what it sounds like. Whenever you play chess, you make your move, you hit your clock, the other person's clock starts ticking, and back and forth and back and forth. So we make a really important assumption here. The number of possible counterclaims is bounded. You cannot have like an infinite number of possible counterclaims, and it will take at most all parties 3.5 days minus a buffer to make on either player's end, right? So that buffer is basically going to be added in to make sure that basically like our current fault-proof window is seven days, right? So 3.5 days is just divided by 2. But they also need some time to be able to make necessary actions such as remove an output or what have you if basically the game ends up resolving to false. So once again, it works exactly as you would expect. If you've ever seen a chess clock, you just tap the clocks back and forth, and each time the other player starts ticking, and while they're making their move, your time is stopped. So we go back to our old visualization, and we now introduce this chess clock mechanism. So the buffer mentioned before is set equal to 0 just for simplicity's sake, and basically every single time that somebody makes a root claim, it is akin to like an opening move in chess. So immediately, the potential, that word comes here again, the potential opponent's time begins to tick. So we can see that in red here, this is the active clock, and this is the potential opponent. So once again, nobody has to challenge this claim. If the claim remains unchallenged after the time runs out, it implicitly resolves to true. We don't need to reference the source of truth that we're about to talk about. We don't need to perform a fault-proof VM step. It just implicitly resolves to true because nobody tried to counter it. So, once or if a counterclaim is made against the root claim, the challenger of the root claim clicks their clock, beginning the defender's clock. The next move is now on the defender. So it took the potential challenger 0.2 days to actually respond. So their chess clock has gone down, they've clicked it, their clock is stopped, and now it's back on the person that made the root claim or somebody that agrees with the root claim's trace to come back in and create a counterclaim against this. So that challenge response process continues all the way down until all necessary counterclaims have been made. So we kind of just show the clock being handed off, and we finally reach the leaf nodes. So once all of these counterclaims have been made, the clock will no longer be of use, and we can enter the resolution phase of the game. So this is kind of where stuff starts to get a little bit more spicy. In order to resolve the game, we need that source of truth that we talked about on the first slide. This is our third requirement. If a claim is never disagreed with, once again, it's considered a resolve to true based on the liveness assumption of honest actors. And to reiterate this liveness assumption, because bonds will be attached to dishonest claims, and dishonest claims may be objectively disproven, honest actors should always be online to claim this MEV opportunity. Everybody likes free money. If you have an honest history, there's no point in not participating in this game. If a disagreement is had at the most fundamental level of the claims, the leaf nodes, then we must rely on that on-chain oracle as the source of the truth. And that source of truth will actually be what resolves the dispute at the leaf node level of the game. So the purposes of the generic game, this oracle could be anything. It could be a function that always returns true. It could be a multisig. It could be a ZK proof. It could be a fault-proof VM processor that's on-chain, et cetera, et cetera. And in canon, this oracle will be the MIPS or RISC-V processor, which takes in a pre-state S as well as an input to compute the post-state S prime. And basically, we'll compare that S prime against the expected state root and figure out who wins in that situation. So, previously, we've off-screened this process of determining the correctness of claims and just colored them in as if we knew them already. This time, we're going to rely on the on-chain oracle to determine the correctness of the leaf node disagreement. So once we get down to this leaf node, we're going to consult the oracle and ask it to tell us if this leaf node is truthy. So we're going to off-screen this again. We'll talk about this later. But in this example, the oracle has determined that the counterclaim 4 was the correct response here. And from that, we can actually derive that the grandparent claims are correct as well. So remember, claims always disagree with their parents. And because of that, that means that they implicitly agree with their grandparents. So, counterclaim 3, as well as its grandparents, are also implicitly disproven due to the property that counterclaims always disagree with their parents. This process we've informally referred to as the odd-even rule, because you kind of have this odd-even behavior of agreements and disagreements. And so, there's another really, really important thing here, which is that we cannot have two actors. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but a core property of the game is that any actor may respond to any claim. Up until now, we've only covered what the game would look like with only two players, a single challenger and a single defender. If we only allow these two players to partake in the game, we run into a very severe issue. The challenger and defender could be colluding, which could result in them manipulating the final resolution of the game. It's very bad. So, we can make a very small expansion to the chess clock rules to allow for permissionless responses to any given claim. The addition is actually really simple. Counterclaims will always inherit the clock of their grandparent, spawning a parallel clock, which allows for people with, n many execution trace histories to participate in the game, and it'll kind of bifurcate out and become really complicated. But what this allows us to actually do is introduce more actors into the game and still retain the assertion that the game will always resolve within that maximum time limit so that we have our answer at the end. So we go back to our prior example, but this time we include the second incorrect counterclaim against the root claim, counterclaim 5, right? And so we talked about how there can only be a single correct counterclaim against a claim, but there can be n many incorrect claims. Because basically these aren't actually, this bond is not going to have to cover these incorrect claims, so you can have as many incorrect claims incorrect counterclaims against a claim as you want. So, we now have two chess clocks. By virtue of counterclaim 5 being different than counterclaim 1, we can infer that counterclaim 5 is being made for a different truth than counterclaim 1. Because if counterclaim 5's history agreed with counterclaim 1, they would have done nothing because they agreed with counterclaim 1, and that was the counterclaim that they would have made if this one didn't already exist. So by virtue of them creating this, it means that they also disagree with this claim. So an interesting thing happened here. The actor who created counterclaim 5 decided to actually go offline, which led to their claim implicitly resolving to false due to their clock running out of time. We can see that basically they decided to never, I missed my arrow here, but they decided to never actually respond to this counterclaim 6 and never reach the deepest level of the tree down here. So, but more importantly here, counterclaim 6 received no counterclaims itself, which led to it implicitly resolving to true. And this is the more important one of the two. We want the deepest one. So for this subgame, the one that goes off to the right, the oracle was actually not needed in order for it to resolve. We could just follow those simple rules to allow it to basically like bubble up that subgame. And so the left subgame, just like in the last example, was able to reach a disagreement in the leaf node. So to resolve this dispute, we consult the on-chain oracle and follow that odd-even rule to bubble this back up to the root claim. And we have the same thing for the incorrect claims here. And basically that allows us to resolve both of those separate trees. So this is kind of the end of the generic section, and we're going to recap some of the properties of that generic dispute game before we go on into applying them into canon. So from the bond logic, we know that we can only support one correct counterclaim for every single claim. To remind you, it's because we cannot split this bond up. At the time of the creation of claim, we cannot tell how much our bond is actually going to need to cover. So we need to have only one correct counterclaim for every single claim. From the chess clock logic, we know that the game must always resolve within that maximum time limit. It's really, really important that we have a decision on our dispute games by the end of a maximum time limit, which the odds are is going to be our fault-proof window. If a disagreement is found in the leaf node of a tree, we also must have that on-chain source of truth to resolve the disagreement. And if a chess clock runs out of time, and that final claim of the party that the chess clock belongs to has a counterclaim attached to it, then that final claim by the timed out party implicitly resolves to false. If no counterclaims are made against a claim within the time limit of the master chess clock, then that claim implicitly resolves to true. And at the end of it, if a disagreement is found at the lowest level of the game, so in the leaf nodes, we must rely on the on-chain oracle to resolve the dispute. I think my clicker stopped working. Oh, wait, there we go. I think it just lagged for a second. Okay. Awesome. So when combining the bond and chess clock properties, we can also see that it is safe to allow permissionless responses to any claim that has been made in the game. So remember, that really fundamental issue occurs when we only allow two players to participate, which is that two dishonest actors may collude with each other and manipulate the final resolution of the game. Obviously, we don't want that. That's very bad. So now that we have a foundation, let's dive into how this generic dispute game can be applied to finding disagreement within an execution trace. Yeah?
Yo, I have a question. I was just going to say, I feel like maybe either this slide or the previous slide with like all of the different arrows. That's a good moment for someone, if there is something that is not clear, to ask the question, not just for your understanding, but also for like the posterity of this recording.
Yeah. So I think now would be a wonderful time before we move on into canon to stop for questions. I know that I've kind of been going a little bit quick, so I'll slow down for a second. Does anybody have any questions on the simple concepts that we've introduced so far? Yeah.
Right. So for the thank you. For the subgames, you say it's like completely permissionless for anyone to like dispute it, right? Mm. So theoretically, that would include even the person that made the agent that made the initial claim.
Yes. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Okay. Yeah. Yep.
So if someone makes an invalid claim, you have these multiple, you say you support one correct counterclaim.
Yeah.
So, okay, the bond is distributed when? It's distributed at the end of the game when it finally resolves, or is it distributed at every single step?
Yeah, so that's actually a really important question, and it becomes a lot clearer in the next section. But as we're actually resolving the game, what we do is we prune nodes away from the tree as we step back up, right? So during that process, as we're pruning the nodes, the bonds will be paid out based off of the truth that's decided at the bottom leftmost node disagreement within the tree. So that bond basically gets paid back after the master chess clock has been paid out and as you're stepping back up during the resolution function.
So I guess what I'm trying to get at is it the case that if somebody makes a counterclaim, an invalid counterclaim, you don't have to put up yet another bond for all of the, if I make 10 invalid counterclaims,
Yeah,
to respond to those 10 invalid counterclaims, do I need to put up 10 bonds?
you do actually, because at the time of creating those counterclaims, we have no concept as to what the truth of those claims is, right?
Okay.
So that truth is basically put in a box when you create your counterclaim, and then we open up that box during the resolution process once we've either A, timed out, or B, no counterclaims were made against it, or C, we consult that on-chain source of truth, right? So you do need those bonds attached to them, and you basically will lock them up until the resolution process concludes.
Which is fine because it's not actually different than making 10 invalid initial claims in the first place, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, so it follows the same logic. So,
And
yeah.
the bond is on the counter, like this claim, and then a bunch of yeah.
It's okay, no worries.
Oh,
All right.
Great. This claim, then there's the 10 counterclaims.
Yeah.
Then the 10 new bonds are not on the original claim; they're on the counterclaims to the counterclaim.
Yes.
Counterclaim.
Yeah, I understand. But another important feature that I'm interested in is, well, I guess we'll talk about it later, but that the actual final payouts happen not immediately, but sort of at the end when everything is resolved.
Exactly.
Is that correct? Okay.
So they're held all the way until the resolution phase of the game.
Okay.
So like if you make a bond on day one, you're not actually going to get paid out, assuming that your bond was attached to a correct counterclaim, until the very end of the game, like when we resolve everything.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, what's up?
Yeah, we got a question from one of our remote folks. Kevin, you want to go?
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, cool. I have two general questions. Mostly wondering whether you agree, because this is observed from kind of a few different dispute game efforts, but I don't know whether it applies here. So the first one is, so punishment is necessary for the claims that are proven to be false, but reward is not necessary for this protocol for the challenger. That applies to that means we don't really need to pay out to the challengers as an incentive in this protocol.
Well, so
do you agree, or do you think differently?
I disagree. I think that we do need to incentivize the challengers that are creating these counterclaims because they're actually paying gas in order to create these counterclaims on chain. And so the counterclaims initially, like before you actually get to the VM step, if we're talking about canon, they're actually like decently cheap to make, but at the same time, it's a non-zero value. Like you can't expect every single person to be altruistic and just create these claims out of their own, these counterclaims out of their own pocket, assuming an invalid claim comes along. And so that's why everybody attaches a bond to each one of their claims, so that basically the people that counter them, if they counter them correctly, they basically take the bond, and that basically applies both the incentive and the disincentive.
I see. Thank you for sharing your opinion here. We should probably discuss offline, because I think in the MVP protocol, the punishment, the slashing is necessary to prevent DOS attacks, but I think for the challenger, there is a motivation from outside the protocol to pose challenges, and that is already sufficient for an MVP until we figure out whether it's necessary to have payout. But yeah, it's also good to know your thoughts. Let's take the further discussion offline.
Yeah,
the second one is the dispute game should only falsify a claim. It does not make the challenger's claim correct. Is that also true in this protocol?
Yeah, to an extent. So basically, like, when we jump into the resolution logic later in the game, it'll become a lot more clear how that actually works. But for the most part, correct. The purpose of the dispute game primarily is to be able to disprove invalid root claims, right? So, like, let's say somebody basically posted an output of their L2 state. Somebody, like, the whole goal here is that basically if somebody agrees with it, they're not going to counter it at all, right? We're just going to wait for the clock to resolve to time out. And then basically it's going to implicitly resolve to true. But if we have somebody that posts an incorrect output, we want to be able to come along and push it down to the actual like step within the block state transition and execute that state transition on chain in order to figure out whether or not they were telling the truth.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
So there's only one correct counterclaim for every claim.
Yeah.
But we don't know at the time that they're being made if they're correct or not.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So do we just reward the first one?
So basically, the thing about it is that when you create a counterclaim, right, it's hash data. So if you think about like the Merkleized fraud-proof VM state, if I have the same execution trace as another party and they've already created the correct counterclaim, I would be creating the exact same claim as them. So if they've already created it, I don't have to go in and recreate it. And in fact, the contracts won't allow me to. Does that make sense?
Yes. I think my question was going to be, is there like MEV here to front run correct counterclaims? So how do we deal with
So that's really interesting. So if you think about it, if there's like a very large bond attached to something and somebody wants that bond, if you think about that property that we can objectively disprove incorrect claims, somebody may come along and say like, I want to try to be the person that counters every single one of these because if I can objectively prove it or objectively disprove it, I'll get all of those bonds, right? So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter a ton to us because they're still performing the service that we want them to perform, but it is a problem in the sense that, like, let's say you basically just collude with Flashbots validators and try to basically...
Exactly. I just like copy your hash.
Exactly. And front run it and try to basically claim the bond each time, right? So there is somewhat of an attack vector there, but it also, the dispute game doesn't break. Like, it would still resolve correctly because, like, you're still...
Well, other than it breaks the incentive for anyone to make valid challenges.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
So this is like the verifier's dilemma, right?
Yeah.
Like you're basically saying that because someone can front run you, you don't want to like play a priority gas auction or something like that. I think this kind of game ends up resolving in just like the block producer.
Do you want the
just, like,
microphone down?
I think it's enough with the one with hat.
Oh, yeah.
I don't.
This is really interesting. So.
My problem is that I never remember my random words. So, but just to reiterate, I think that this sort of game, it ends up in just like the block producer censoring everyone else, but then just including the transaction for free money themselves. Mm-hmm. But I think in practice, like we have this like builder proposer separation thing. Are people going to like build special plugins that do this? I don't know how it's going to play out in practice, but all I know is that I don't think that I do think that people will take the money because it's free money.
So the reason that but it's free money for the validators if they could censor you. So are you saying this is like a layer 0 thing where people just won't do it?
No.
I still think people will do it.
People will do it. I think that the way that it'll play out in practice is like, you know, we'll have like different MEV searchers that'll be like searching, and they'll include their bundles into, a block proposal, and then, a block template kind of thing. And then they'll send it. These are like the builders, right? So the builders will there'll be competing builders that both include it, and then whichever one ends up paying more to the validator, right? It's just like how PBS works. I do think that someone will do it, I guess, here.
So I think the way this probably plays out in the end is that, there'll definitely be bots trying to steal this, but the same applies to front-running any DeFi transaction. Once you publish a transaction that's trying to do that front run, anyone else can say, oh, there's an opportunity, I'll steal that. Mm-hmm. And so the reason people still submit those transactions are because they have trust in whichever pool they're submitting to, so say Flashbots, for example, that they will keep that transaction secret and include it in the block because they're paid for, without disclosing it to other people that are competing. And if they break that, then all of a sudden their business disappears because no one will ever submit MEV to them anymore.
Yeah.
So there's that kind of outside this protocol incentive, but it's the broader kind of incentives around MEV in general, I think, that probably save it.
I guess my only nit here is that my only nit here is that front running like a DeFi transaction is like you can extract a tax on it, but you don't get the whole pie. Whereas here, if I front run this, I get the whole challenge reward.
You do for that specific counterclaim. So there's like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so if you front run in this case, let's say you're playing a priority gas auction, right? Then you would be getting a smaller piece of the pie, right? Up until a point where it's kind of like that Harvard business, study where like they're like giving people money, but then people are like willing to like they kind of are committed. So then they ending up wanting to lose money. Did you know the study that I'm talking about? They pay money to get money, and then they end up losing money. So basically, you get into a point where like you're competing, right? But like you're going to lose, right? But now you've got this sunk cost, right? And then you're like, okay, well, I'd rather win the game itself, but then lose $1 instead of losing the game and losing $100. So now you're like competing like past the point of profitability, and both people are like losing out, right? So that's like priority gas auctions in like the worst case. So I do think like the same property applies if you're playing priority gas auctions.
Yeah, I'm curious how we think that when we have, say, multiple false claims at like root claims, so independent of one another, how that ends up playing out.
Gotcha. So multiple false root claims actually implies multiple separate games. So you could have multiple false counterclaims against a root claim, but if you think about like that root claim is like the core of an individual game. So whenever you create a root claim and somebody counters that root claim, that's what actually starts the game. And so we'll get into that in a little bit in the next slides, but that actually, like, those root claims represent completely different games from one another. Is that what you were looking for, or is there anything else there?
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at, but it seems to me like that's an important element, that you have this same MEV game possibly playing out on multiple different claims at the same time.
Yeah, you absolutely can. So these things can run in parallel, and the challenge agents will basically be listening to all active games to see if they actually disagree. And so those will be the off-chain actors that are listening to the event emissions of all created dispute games, at least while they're active, and they can participate in them simultaneously because it's just a bunch of bots, right? Sorry, 1 second. Not sure if there's anything else.
Oh, yeah,
Mofi? Oh, no, I was seeing if you had anything else.
Cool.
Sorry.
Could you go back to that slide with the sub games?
Yeah, sure. So this is also like, we'll see this in a second. This isn't a wonderful diagram. The actual game is tree-shaped, but this is just to try to make it a little bit easier. Yeah.
Okay, so like two things that like trying to bring up. One, you mentioned that if someone has already made like a claim, the contract would actually enforce anyone, like a different challenger, from coming in and making the same claim. Okay, so in the case where the challenger is colluding with the person that made the master claim, how would that play out? So the challenger makes it...
Very interesting question. Right. Yeah, so that's actually in the next section. We have an entire decision tree that will show basically like every single possible response that you could make to a claim with a counterclaim attached to it.
Oh, perfect.
And so, and so basically in that situation, like for instance, if I disagreed with this and I disagreed with this, what I would want to do is I would want to supply a counterclaim to counterclaim 1, but I would also want to supply an alternative counterclaim to the root claim in that situation, if I disagreed with both of those things. Because there are two bonds that I disagree with that have two claims that have bonds attached to them that I disagree with, and I want both of those bonds because it's free money.
Yeah, I
right?
kind of expected that would happen, but I'm more worried about the case where the colluder, the challenger, would just make a claim, and that effectively like dosses anyone else from making that claim, and they just let the game like time out, right? And by the end of that particular game, there isn't much time left on the clock, I guess.
Well, so are you saying that basically if somebody like let's say like somebody that had an honest trace came in and created a counterclaim and then decided to not participate the rest of the way down?
Well, you can't even distinguish that between an honest person and malicious, but yes, something like that.
Well, so that's like the really important property that anybody can come along. And so in that in like the last example that we have in this presentation, we show basically like two honest actors basically like passing back and forth that responsibility. So like this could be somebody that like this could be one party, this could be an entirely separate party, and this could be an entirely separate party as well. They do all share the same chess clock because they agree with each other, but none of them can block the other parties from coming in and creating a new counterclaim there, right? So like just because this person was the first person to create a counterclaim, it doesn't mean that they have to be the person that responds all the way down. You basically have all of these people that have the same execution traces, so they're going to agree with each other and thus make the same claims all the way down. Does that make sense?
I'm still kind of like worried about wouldn't the bonding requirement increase in that case if, maybe, I guess I'll revisit this once I see like the other examples of like the decision.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Cool. Awesome. So are there any other questions on this section before we move on? Matt?
What actually enforces the fact that every claim needs to disagree with its parent?
Ooh.
Or is that going to be covered subsequently?
Yeah, that's going to be covered kind of later on.
Okay,
So you kind of have this thing where you have this decision tree where, go ahead, Carl.
I mean, I was just going to give a stupid intuition, which is like every counterclaim implicitly disagrees with its parent, because if you didn't disagree with the parent, then you wouldn't make the counterclaim. In other words, there are two options. There's, A and then not A. And then there's A again. And then not A again, A again. You see how you know what I'm saying, and that's how that's why those arrows point up to the grandparents, and it's because of the property that you can either agree or disagree, and that means that you have a not or a true. You have like a A or not A option.
Yeah, because if you think about it, like if you create a counterclaim against a claim that you agree with, what you're basically saying is that like I'm trying to disprove this claim that I'm creating the counterclaim for, right? And so from there, like why would you do that? The claim that you would have created because you agree with it already exists. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. I'll rephrase once I understand a little more about like the actual mechanism.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Seb?
Yeah, just for understanding, but the implementation should still check that. Otherwise, you could just try to extract the bond.
Yeah.
Just like
Yeah.
It's a very simple tool, but it could be implemented.
Yeah, the implementation will definitely check that.
Cool.
Yeah.
I think that was more thrust in my question.
Gotcha. All right, so basically now that we have that kind of general theory, unless anybody else has any more questions, we can move on to how we can actually apply this to Cannon's dispute games, right? So Cannon will employ two nested dispute games that when composed together act as if they're one. So we have game A, which is this block hash bisection game. And the goal of that game is to basically find the exact block hash at which multiple L2 chain histories diverge. They're going to be two or more, right? So we'll refer to the block at which the two histories diverged as B. And then game B is the execution trace bisection game. The high-level goal of this is to basically find the exact instruction within the state transition from block B-1 to B at which multiple VM states diverge. And once again, that can be two or more VM states. And so we can represent this as a composite function, which is basically that B is composed of A, and A takes in two inputs. It takes in the block hash of the claim, and it also takes in the block number of the claim. And the reason that we have to have the block number is so that the first bisection in the block hash game can actually reach this maximum depth, and we'll see more when we define like the partial interface in a couple of slides. Oh, actually, it's this one. Wonderful. So we're going to define two functions here, right? Which is pivot, and it accepts a depth and an index and gives you a pivot point. So we talk about bisection, and these pivot points are basically these choices at which you can decide to go left or right. So if I have a 100 instruction long trace, the first pivot point that I'm going to supply is at instruction number 50. And basically, if we think about a Merkleized fault-proof VM state, that the Merkle root of the or the Merkleized representation of the fault-proof VM state at instruction 50, if we agree with it, basically the only thing that we can conclude is that our trace is the same from instructions 0 through 50, right? We have no concept of 51 through 100. And then if we disagree with it, we know that there was some sort of divergence before that actual pivot point. So the pivot function is really simple. It will provide a pivot point within the tree at a certain depth and index combination. So the pivot function is also multi-layered, which allows us to compose these two games together. Before a defined depth is reached, it will return block hashes. That's the block hash bisection game. Past this defined depth, it will return a Merkleized fault-proof VM state, and that enters the execution trace bisection game. And so we also have the second function, which is called step, and accepts a pre-state and produces a post-state. And so for the purposes of the following examples, so that I don't have to put a bunch of hashes on the screen, we define like a very simple step function. States are represented as letters in the alphabet, and calling step pre simply just moves to the next letter. So it's like step A goes to B, etc. And in Canon, this function will actually be performed by the on-chain fault-proof VM processor, which is MIPS, RISC-V, etc. And so the step function only operates on this lowest level of the tree, right, which is the actual instruction trace. And it takes in this pre-state. So like if we say that like A is the pre-state, or we have like Genesis off to the left, we basically can take step A and produce B. Step B can produce C. And so the way that we're actually able to do this in a truthy way is that Genesis is actually derived from data that's already available on L1. Is there any questions about that?
Real quick, let me talk about that. And that's like something that has been implemented and suggested a bunch for these L2 protocols. That's the first note. Just like definitely remember that that's what that is. And the second note is that this tree is a tree of pivot points and steps. This is not the same tree that we were looking at before, which was a tree of claims. The tree of claims is will be used. This tree is in some sense the meat of the claim tree. The claim tree is kind of like the framework, the shell, and then this tree is the like attack response.
Exactly. Yeah.
Responses for each one. Anyway, you'll get into that later. I just want to make sure that people aren't like, wait, why did the tree just explode?
Yeah. I think that's a really important distinction.
Different tree.
Wait, I saw somebody else say something? Okay, no. Sweet. So we can move on to the pivot function. So the pivot function, if you remember, takes in those two parameters, depth and index. And so the index is moved from left to right on each level. So for example, if we wanted to basically get the pivot at depth 2 and index 1, we end up here, right? Pretty simple. You basically just kind of go down and then left or right depending on your index. There's also this important property of this function, which is that if I supply like an out-of-bound index, right, it's just going to return the last one. So if I wanted to get like the pivot at depth 2, index 5, it's just going to return this one, right? So we're going to start off with a block hash bisection game. Remember, our goal here is to find the leftmost block at which the histories of the attackers, plural, and the initial claim diverge, right? And the reason that we want to find the leftmost block is because that is basically the earliest disagreed upon state transition that we can find. And that is the one that we want to dispute, mainly because it's most likely to contain the actual like mistruth. So the inputs to this game are block hash H and the block number N of the state claim. And this game is like the much more simple of the two. It only relies on that pivot function that we just talked about in the previous slides. And attacking the initial claim, which we kind of hinted at earlier, begins by posting the left pivot of H. So the first move of any dispute game, if you want to attack the root claim, is to basically supply the left pivot on the root claim. So in order to find the divergent block hash, we continue bisecting until we've reached the maximum depth, which is going to be defined by the fault-proof program being utilized. It may be different if we're using MIPS, it may be different if we're using RISC-V, x86, whatever we decide to do. So once we've actually found the leftmost divergent block hash among the attackers and the defender, the pivot function begins to return the Merkleized fault-proof VM states. And this is how we actually compose those two dispute games into one. And remember that like multi-layered property of the pivot function that we discussed earlier. So now we're in the execution trace bisection game. It's kind of similar to the way that Canon works at the moment. Once that earliest disagreed upon block hash B has been found, we can now bisect the state transition from B minus 1 to B in order to find the earliest disagreed upon subtransition. And so once that subtransition has been within a leaf node has been found, we can execute it on chain via the MIPS or RISC-V processor in order to resolve all subclaims that have been made throughout the duration of the game. I guess that should be counterclaims. It's a better terminology. But so a reminder, if no disagreement was found within a leaf node, there was either no counterclaim on the root to begin with, or the players who made the counterclaims have timed out. In this case, the root claim will always implicitly resolve to being true. So this is kind of where it starts to get a little bit more complicated based off of the decision trees. So I apologize in advance, but we're going to try to step through this slowly. So we're going to define two functions: attack with the left pivot and defend with the right pivot. But first, let's talk about attack. By choosing to traverse left, like we said before, we're basically saying that we know that the claim that we are countering relative to our history is incorrect. So because of this, we can assume that the divergent instruction happened earlier on in the execution trace. Remember, this is a Merkleized fault-proof VM state, so if our roots differ, that means that something happened beforehand that changed them. So we go left to try to find the exact instruction at which the two states diverge, or multiple states. And so, again, all in bold, the first action of any game, the opening move, is to attack the root claim by supplying that left pivot. Otherwise, the root claim would be accepted due to having no attached counterclaims. And we also have this other option, which is to defend a claim by supplying a right pivot. And so defending a claim is basically saying that that claim is correct based on our history. But we would still like to explore the instructions to the right of the pivot point in order to determine if we disagree with them. So basically, if we agree at instruction number 50, once again, we have no concept of whether or not we agree from instruction 51 to 100. We have to keep going right in order to figure that out. So, yeah, this is just exactly what I just said. So, these are like all of the possible response options to any claim-counterclaim pair at any level of the game, right? So basically, if you want to think about this as the root claim, you can, but it's not important. This logic works for any claim that has a counterclaim attached to it. And so we encode our opinions on the truthiness of these two claims as the first one is our opinion about the pivot, the first bit, and the second bit is our opinion about the claim that sits above the counterclaim that's in the first bit. Sorry, wordy. But basically, the first option is that we disagree, like we were saying with Mofi earlier, we disagree with both the counterclaim and the claim. And so in that case, what we want to do is we want to expand left, we want to attack left on that counterclaim, but the other thing that we want to do is we want to go back up to the claim above it and create an alternative counterclaim, because we think that this was the incorrect pivot to supply in relation to this claim, right? So there's a second option here. We can also think that this was the incorrect pivot to supply, but we also agree with this claim. In that case, what we want to do is we also want to expand left. But here, because we agree with the claim above it, we don't need to go and create that alternative counterclaim. So the third option is basically that we think that this was the correct pivot, and we also disagree with this claim. So in this case, we do nothing. And the reason for that being is that we disagree with this, and we agree with this. So this counterclaim would have been exactly what we would have posted, assuming that it had not already existed. So we can't create two identical counterclaims. So we just accept it and let it sit and do nothing. And so the third option is that we agree with both of these things, right? We agree with the claim that sits above. We also agree with the counterclaim attached. So we want to expand right to make sure that we don't disagree with this, to find the divergent point in this counterclaim. Because if we agree with this one and we also agree with this one, why would this person have countered it to begin with, right? We still need to go right to find that instruction at which we diverge. And so we can kind of see, like, if we have this 8 instruction trace, this basically means you agree with nothing. This means that you agree with everything kind of like before H. This you agree up to D and then disagree everything past it. And this basically means that you agree from D to H, right? So we can take this logic and actually expand it out into what the decision tree would look like for a short execution trace, which is basically, remember we have that step function, which basically just goes from the letters of the alphabet forward. So we have this execution trace, which is just A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. And we start out by basically saying that if you have a root claim, the first thing that's going to happen is that somebody is going to supply the first pivot at D. Remember, that's always the first opening move. You attack left. So we have rounded down division, so D is going to be the midway point here, and that's why we supply it against the root claim. And so then there are those 4 possible options to respond that we just talked about, right? And every single one of these arrows in these diagrams represents a counterclaim with a right-left choice, and it also has a bond attached to it. I didn't visualize the bonds mainly just because it got really, really cluttered. But you can remember that every single arrow implicitly comes with a bond. And then we're also going to off-screen this alternative counterclaim process. You'll see why at the end it gets really, really messy. But you can always remember that for 0, 0, you're going to create a counterclaim against the pivot and the claim above it because you disagree with both of them. So we can start pulling this down. The next thing to do here, if you basically disagreed with the pivot and either agreed or disagreed with the root claim, is to supply an attack left. Because if you disagree with D, you want to find the instruction at which you diverge to the left. And so here, if I agreed with this pivot and disagreed with the root claim, this is what I would have supplied if it already existed. So we do nothing. We sit. If we agree with both of these things, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to expand right by supplying the right pivot F. And the reason for that being, once again, is that we have to find what the point at which we diverge to the right of the pivot that we agree with. Are there any questions so far on this? I know that this is dense. Kelvin?
So, okay, just to confirm again, the reason why you are even challenging the alt claim is because is it the case that the first counter, like the first claim against the root claim to succeed gets the bond? So you have this
first
incentive.
Claim against the root claim that succeeds. No. So the people that get the bond are people that can actually disprove the claims of which they counter. So like if I have a claim, like a counterclaim to a claim, if I can successfully disprove that claim that exists above me during the resolution process, I take their bond, right? So it's not necessarily just the first person that's able to counter the root claim successfully. Right. And we're going to walk through the resolution process like later on in the slides, but I agree, it is kind of like unclear in this diagram specifically.
But there's a world, that theoretically, if you have 2 claims against the root claim, there's your claim that it's the right claim. There's another counterclaim that's not the right counterclaim, but it is a counterclaim, right? I guess so. The idea is that you want to create this incentive for people to challenge the counterclaim, but you could just let people could just be like, well, it's not really the right counterclaim, but who cares as long as it proves the root claim invalid. You
can't do that because dangling counterclaims implicitly resolve to true. If nobody ever comes along and challenges that incorrect counterclaim, that incorrect counterclaim is going to implicitly resolve to true. We always want to push incorrect counterclaims to the deepest level of the tree that we possibly can.
But if it's that's an interesting discrepancy where all I really care about is the root claim being proven false, not necessarily the counterclaim being proven true. And so like there is a world where if we say, okay, the counterclaim is not actually, we don't say that the counterclaim is true. We just say that, okay, you didn't respond to the counterclaim, therefore your root claim or the claim above it is just implicitly false. But you're sort of leaving a question mark on the final, on the actual final thing, unless you actually do the execution step. Then there is a world where if you treat it like that, then I mean you could just leave the thing there. And I guess the point is that there's a griefing vector where the person can just, it's not actually the right counterclaim, and so they could keep playing this game and then they're proven wrong and so they're not right. But I mean, as long as you're playing the right game, right? As long as you're playing the right proof, what I don't understand is why it's, who cares about the people playing the wrong game?
So I think Proto has something to say on this. He's been sitting on it.
I think the resolution game kind of covers this. The bonds are there for both the root claim and for this counterclaim to be attacked. Now the root claim to correct is much more important. This is what you're saying, like this is the correct path to play. This is the thing that you win the eventual game with, by providing the correct counterclaim as high up in the tree as possible. Now, this other counterclaim that already exists there, you could ignore it because it won't resolve. It will not be prioritized over the correct path that you can take deeper. Now, the one thing that's still there is that there's a bond you could take for MEV, for like as an idea, like okay, there's some marginal value to be gained by also countering that, so you might as well. But it's the root that's more important.
Right.
Yeah, let's let's go for the resolution game first, I guess.
Yeah. So I think you covered what I was going to say as well. But, oh, is that op shooting? Welcome back. All right. So we can keep going with this because remember it's a 8 instruction long trace, and we want to get down to the actual execution trace. So we still haven't even gotten there. So this continues expanding out. It gets really nasty. You can only imagine what this would look like if we had 1,500 instructions. But towards the end of this, we actually get to the correct execution trace on the bottom here. So there's a path at which you could take by responding to any single counterclaim that fits all of these 4 response options to basically get down to any of these execution steps, right? And so these execution steps will be executed by the on-chain oracle, which for Canon is obviously going to be the MIPS or RISC-V processor. And from there, we can actually begin to resolve a game that looks like this. And this is why I didn't include the red arrows. So just for reference, it's kind of nasty. So these are all of like, if you disagreed with both the pivot and the claim above it, you're going to want to challenge this, and you're going to want to go up and challenge this as well. So, but yeah, that's why it's kind of nasty.
Sorry, I'm rebooting replicas.
Oh yeah, no problem at all. But so now we can kind of move on into the resolution function. This part is a bit more complex than like the simple example in the generic dispute game, but it's also, there's not really too much else added here. So we must find the leftmost and deepest counterclaim that is dangling, meaning that it has 0 counterclaims attached to it. Nobody ever tried to counter that node. Any nodes that have been countered cannot resolve without first resolving their children. So we also don't want a node that was on the bottom of the tree. So if we go back to the previous slide, we actually don't want to consider any of these execution steps. So they can be truthy, but the problem is that they don't actually say anything about the final result of the game. And I think that we are lagging. All right, awesome. So, and remember, if there are no nodes that qualify these 2 rules, the root claim just implicitly resolves to true. So if during our resolution process, while we're walking back up the tree and pruning the tree, no nodes qualify, meaning that there's nothing that's not on the bottom of the tree, and also nothing that's dangling, the root claim just implicitly resolves to true. And so we can define 3 actors and make an example and actually show how we can resolve a game that basically has a root claim that's honest and a root claim that's dishonest. So Alice creates the root claim with the correct execution trace, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. Bob agrees with Alice. He's an honest actor. And then Mallory comes in with an execution trace that diverges on the state transition from B to C. So instead of going from B to C, she goes to B to I, and then from then on, her execution trace differs. So we can go back to this decision tree diagram whenever it loads. Sweet. So Alice creates a root claim on the state of the fault-proof VM at H. She is an honest actor and has the correct history. So remember, the root claim is basically a commitment to your fault-proof VM state after the last instruction has executed, right? So Mallory comes in and says, I disagree with this root claim. So the first move that I am going to make is to create a counterclaim against the root node by supplying her first pivot point, which is going to be the halfway at J. So Bob looks at the root claim and the pivot point that Mallory supplied and determines that this is the correct move that he should make, right? So he thinks that the pivot J is incorrect, but he agrees with the root claim. So we go with 0, 1. We expand left. Bob basically gives B, which is the next pivot point at this step.
Sorry, that was me again.
No, you're good. You're good.
This way? This way?
Oh, no. This is the right one. Oh, there. Yeah.
Perfect.
So the next thing is that Mallory is going to come back in and say that I agree with claim J because I made it, of course. It could be somebody else. It could be somebody that had a similar or the exact same malicious execution trace. But Mallory also has B in her trace, right? So Mallory, from Mallory's point of view, B was the correct pivot point to supply here. So because of that, Mallory basically agrees with B and also agrees with J because we're looking only at the counterclaim and the claim above it. Remember that like relative claim decision diagram. And basically from here, we're going to choose 1, 1. This was the correct pivot to supply, and I agree with the and above it. So we're going to expand right, and she's going to supply her next correct pivot point, which is I. And so now we're pretty much finally at the bottom of the game. Alice steps back in to make the final counterclaim. She agrees with the claim B that sits above, but disagrees that I was the correct pivot point to supply here. So because of this, she expands left, and because we're at the bottom of the tree, she asks for the execution or for the state transition from B to C to be executed on chain. And so this state transition succeeds, so we add this node to the tree. And note that this is exactly where their two histories diverge, right? This is exactly where we wanted to end up. So now that we have this example laid out, we can actually start to resolve upwards. So there's only one last thing that we need to consider here, is that each claim must have a reference counter attached to it. If you've written Rust before, you've probably used reference counters a lot. In our contracts, we can just introduce a reference counter as a simple mapping. Hopefully we can just pack this into something else so that we don't have to have a bunch of separate mappings here. So basically we go back to the same claim or the same example and set all of these reference counters here. So basically the root claim has one reference, which is J. This has one reference, which is basically B, and then so on and so forth until we get here where we have this dangling node. And this state transition got added to the tree because it actually ran successfully and proved something. And so we can define our resolution function now. The resolution function begins by looping through all claims with a reference count equal to 0 until the entire tree has been pruned. So we have this while loop that sits on the outer side, and that while loop is basically going to keep going until we have no claims that have a reference count equal to 0 in our world state, right? And so on each iteration of that interior loop that's looping through all of the claims with a reference count equal to 0, we're basically going to have this resolve step function. And this is basically some pseudocode for the resolve step function, which is basically that if the target, let's go back for a second. We're going to keep track of the deepest and leftmost claim that we found during this resolution process with this variable named L. That's going to be really important for resolving the game at the end. And so, basically, on the interior of the loop, we execute this function that has a target as the parameter, and if the target is not countered, and the target is also not at max depth, meaning it's not one of those execution trace steps, and also if the target is further left or deeper than the current L, we're going to set L equal to the target. And then, outside of that conditional, if the target is not the root, we're going to decrement the target's parent reference counter by 1. That's pretty intuitive. The root doesn't have a parent, so we can't decrement their parent's reference counter. And then regardless of what we have, we're going to prune that target from the tree. We're going to actually delete that node and remove it. And so after all iterations of this resolve step target have been executed, we simply check the depth of L to resolve the game. And if the L's depth is even, the root was successfully defended. If L's depth is odd, the root was successfully attacked. And if L's depth was never set, then the root claim just implicitly resolves to true, because remember, we have that property that if nothing actually qualified for these bounds, then the root claim just implicitly resolves to true. So we can start to do exactly this, right? So we have this node on the bottom that basically, it's at the bottom of the tree. So that automatically disqualifies us from this conditional, right? So we're just going to prune it and decrement the target's parent reference counter by 1. So we remove that, decremented the target's parent reference counter, but this counterclaim had a counterclaim itself. It was this one, right? So it also is disqualified on this bound here. So all that we're going to do is prune it from the tree and basically continue moving upwards. And so the same thing that we just covered applies for all of these all the way up until we get to the root node. L continues to be nil as we go up because it can never be set based off of our rules. And this game was really simple to resolve. We basically had L equals nil because no claims qualified the requirements during the pruning process, so that root claim just implicitly resolved to true. But what does this game look like if we just invert this example that we have here, right? So what happens if we have an invalid root claim, and then this is the correct pivot, incorrect, correct, and so on, right? So basically, the game functions a little bit differently. If we invert it, we can basically see that we have that invalid root claim, correct counterclaim, so on and so forth, and we actually get down to that exact same execution step. But the difference here is that because Mallory's requested state transition from B to I failed, remember we derived genesis from L1, so we can actually say that that state transition failed. It will not get added to the tree, and this valid pivot point claim will be left dangling. So she can try to execute it over and over again. Nothing's going to happen. This is just going to get left dangling. And so, basically, we're going to go up, correct the diagram. The other one never got added. Now, we actually have something that qualifies the constraints of that resolve step to actually set L. So this is not at the bottom of the tree. It's not within those execution traces, but it is dangling. So we're going to set L equal to this, decrement the parent's reference counter, and prune it. So now we have L is equal to C at depth 3, and we keep going. This one was countered, so we can't set L. We keep going up. We decrement the parent's reference counter. This one also had the counterclaim attached to it, which was B, so we can't set that to L either. Keep going up. And so we can resolve this game now, right? We're all the way back up at the root claim. When resolving the inverse, we see that L was set, so we just check if the depth of L is even or odd. So remember, if L's depth is even, the root was properly defended, and if L's depth is odd, the root was successfully attacked. So L's depth mod 2 is equal to 1, so the root was correctly disproven. That's exactly what we wanted. We had dishonest actors coming in and challenging this invalid root claim. And this actually works. Thanks to Proto, we have a crude prototype of this model, and we can see that the game actually resolves as expected with the same actors that we used in the prior example. So we can see that basically with Mallory, it always resolves to false. With Alice, it always resolves to true. And with Bob, it always resolves to true as well. And this is really cool. First of all, thank you very much for this Proto, because it helped me a lot. So, awesome. So now we do the thing. We've kind of got it working. So we've got the beginnings of the generic dispute game contracts in this repo. But just a disclaimer, the contract implementation is really an early work in progress. A few assumptions have changed since the project was initially laid out 3 weeks ago. But thanks to Proto, once again, I'm really, really confident that we can ship an unoptimized implementation based off of his reference implementation super quickly. And so now, questions. I might have answers.
Yes. So in your example, the state traces are the same length. What if they don't have the same length?
Yeah, so that's actually something that's really important. You would actually just decide your pivot point based off of like the halfway point of your execution trace length. And at that point, like the decision tree still applies exactly the same. You would still land at the same state transition that you needed to be at. But like you would also have like that same property of basically you would have one person that would have that provable state transition and one person that wouldn't. And that would basically be because like you would get to the point at which they diverge. You have that input that is derived from data that's already available on L1. And then from there, you can kind of create that provable state transition and disprove the person that had the lengthier execution trace. I think Proto has something to add to this as well.
Something to emphasize maybe is that the tree, the binary tree, can have that. I'll repeat. So something to emphasize is that the tree, the binary tree, can have a maximum depth. It has like this fixed capacity. This capacity should be much, much larger than any regular trace, but this will effectively add padding to the trace that people produce. And so even if you disagree about the length of the game, the tree will look the same, it will have the same depth. And so you should be able to resolve to a point of divergence regardless of the total length.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, so my question is around who chooses the pivot. Is this pivot location enforced by the smart contract, or does the client decide where the pivot is?
So the client will actually decide where the pivot is themselves by deciding basically like looking at their own execution trace. So if we can go like all the way back, it's pretty far back, but to that like decision tree at the very beginning here, right? So basically like if I am going to counter the root claim, for example, the first thing that I want to do is supply like my pivot and attack left, right?
Yeah.
And so that pivot is going to be the midpoint of my execution trace. Now it doesn't have to be. I could supply something completely wrong. I could supply the 75% waypoint, but at the same time, like I can always go back and counter that as an honest actor, and basically like because it doesn't matter exactly where they supply the pivot, given the fact that at the bottom level of the tree you can objectively prove them wrong.
Got it. So
sense?
if you provide a suboptimal pivot point, you're just burning your own bond effectively, right?
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly, yeah. So that's like that disincentive piece, which is like if we can push you all the way down to the bottom of the tree, like you're going to lose your money anyway, right? Because we have that source of objective truth with the fault-proof processor.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, sweet. Thanks for listening to me ramble.